Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, could I ask you to take your seats, please, so we can begin the afternoon session. Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished ministers and vice ministers, distinguished delegates, I call to order the third meeting of the 56th session of the Commission for Social Development. I invite the Commission to continue its consideration of item 3A, entitled Priority Theme, Strategies for Eradicating Poverty to Achieve Sustainable Development for All. And this afternoon, the Commission will hold a high-level panel discussion precisely on this item. I'm pleased to welcome our distinguished speakers for this afternoon. To my right, Mr. Juan Somavia will be our keynote speaker. He's currently the director of the Diplomatic Academy of Chile, former special advisor to the Secretary General on interregional policy cooperation, and a former president of ECOSOC, as well as a former director general of the International Labour Organization. Her Excellency Ana Elena Chacon, Vice President of the Republic of Costa Rica, sits immediately to my right. Her Excellency Ghada Wali, Minister of Social Solidarity of Egypt, sits next to the Vice President. Mr. Mark Kappenhoff, Head of Unit of the European Coordination International Affairs Department of the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth of Germany. And to my left, Mr. Mark McGreevy, Group Chief Executive of DePaul International, which oversees and coordinates a group of charities in the United Kingdom, Ireland, Slovakia, Ukraine, France, Croatia, and the United States. And last but not least, also to my left, I'm delighted to welcome our moderator, Ms. Jane Barrett, who is the Secretary General of the International Federation on Aging, a non-governmental organization in general consultative status with ECOSOC. As a lead-off to our high-level panel discussion on the priority theme, I have the pleasure to invite our distinguished keynote speaker, Mr. Juan Somavia, to address the Commission. Mr. Somavia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you for the invitation and this very interesting fellow panelists that I have. Señora Vicepresidenta, muchas gracias por su...
Distinguished Vice President, thank you very much for your briefing this morning, as well as for your personal presence here this afternoon.
Before arriving here, so thank you, and all of you on the panel, thank you so much for being here and what we're going to do. Chair, I found that the meeting in the morning is very useful for this panel because it sort of sets the scenario, and particularly for me because I don't have to go into individual issues or put statistics on the table. They all appeared in the morning, and you're in the process of discussing what would be the conclusions of this meeting, which also sets the scenario in terms of you as delegates. Let me say what I will try to do. I would like to take a look at the obstacles ahead. We talked a lot in the morning what needs to be done. I would like to take a look at the obstacles from three perspectives: from the 2030 agenda with its objectives, its targets, its indicators, its goals, targets and indicators. The beginning of the implementation, but we're just beginning, but we already see that there's an enormous differentiation between countries as to what the priorities are going to be, as to what is more important in one region or another, or in one country or another. Differentiation is very clear. And then at the same time, we have all of the proposals from the Secretary General in order to organize both some of the intergovernmental work, which is up to governments to decide, but also informing us of what he wants to do with the United Nations Development System. I will try to take a look at those three things as I go along. My first point is that the agenda has a three-legged stool, but there's one of the legs that is a little bit flimsy. What do I mean to say? We're supposed to integrate economic, social, and environmental from a United Nations perspective, from the perspectives of the government members. It's not difficult to do that in environment because we have Stockholm, Rio 92, Rio 2002, 2012, and of course the 2030 agenda. It's not difficult to do it on the social side because we have a long tradition, including this commission, a long tradition of social issues discussions in the United Nations, but of course the one that put it together is the Social Summit. And all of these issues are now projected into the 2030 agenda. Where we have the problem is, what is the UN basis on the economic side? And for different reasons, this is not an area that we have deepened sufficiently. And I just would like to highlight that fact because I think that we have a lot of work to do in the following sense. I'm looking at the issue in terms of what are the problems that countries may face and in which way the United Nations can help those countries deal with the issues. And if a government comes and says, well, what is the United Nations perspective? What have you done in the last 10, 20, 30 years on the economic side that can help me put together this integrated dimension of economic, social, environmental? There is something, there's no doubt, because all agencies have worked on it, but it doesn't have the depth, the significance, the technical know-how that you have behind the other two. So I would just like to say that I believe that this is an area that the United Nations development system needs to deepen. Probably an important work for DESA, for the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, who has, an excellent report on world and economic world situation, economic situation and prospects, and a number of other things. And many of the agencies have lots of economic work, but if we want to have the same level of security or guarantee or whichever way you want to call it when we look at the environment and the social, we do not have it on the economic side. And I would say basically what is it that we would need as governments or as society? Well, what would be the UN view of what is the economy of sustainable development? What does it mean? We've postulated that we want sustainable development. It would we know to see how we develop, what are the economic notions behind sustainable development. And this brings it with a number of issues. Inequality, mentioned a lot this morning. Globalization, a fair globalization, mentioned this morning. The quality of growth. The fact that the financial system, in fact, is in the driver's seat of the global economy, when probably what we're all interested in is to see the real economy in the driver's seat of the global economy. I'm just giving some examples. It would be good to see what is it that from a UN perspective we can say, well, these are the economic components of sustainable development in order to be able to integrate economic, social, and environmental. My second point is that we need to deepen the notion of multidimensionality. Clearly, it's around in terms of poverty. But the fact is, if you take a look at the 17 goals, each one of them is multidimensional. But again, that's an area to be investigated, to be looked at, to be deepened, to be analyzed. It's not something that we open page 17 and we see, all of the multi-dimensions that every one of the goals has. We do not have that. So I believe, again, I was mentioning that DESA could do an important role in promoting an economic thinking, not because it has installed capacities, but it has the capacity to convene others. I see the same thing happening in the multidimensional part of it. We have advanced on poverty, there's no doubt. But I would think that I would count with probably both fingers in my hand countries that are actually implementing a multidimensional view of poverty. Now, what's the problem with this? It's a serious problem. And let me begin by the political problem. Up to now, we've measured poverty from an income point of view, 125, 190, etc. Suddenly you say, no, you have to do it multidimensional. Why? Because that's the way people live it. So we're not going to last very long saying that poverty is just income poverty. There's no way that can happen in real political life. People are going to say, okay, but have all of these other dimensions of poverty. But then it will mean that poverty is bigger than we have been saying. And you have to manage that politically. That's an objective problem. But we will have to see how we bite that bullet. Because you can't deny it simply because it's going to create, we better see how we manage the problem rather than say, no, let's not deal with it until it explodes. So this multidimensional part, I think, is very important. There are works done. Oxford has done it. UNDP has done some work. Some of the regional commissions have advanced. Some countries have done it. In the case of Chile, it was 11% income. We made a calculation. It came to about 21% real. Okay, we had to deal with it. So I'm just mentioning that the multidimensional part, I think, is going to be rather important that we look at it. Again, I mentioned DESA because it's very easy to sort of tell it should be done. Somebody has to do it, etc. I believe that DESA in the multidimensional part is very interesting. It has 8 divisions. I think it's 8, or maybe 8 divisions that do very different things. So if you want to look at a problem, you want to look at poverty, for example, from a multidimensional view, you probably have inside of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs already a good set of different minds looking at these issues, but who have been looking at these issues in the traditional way. You worry about your division, your department, and your issues. And suddenly the agenda says, no, now you've got to look at them all together. Where do we begin? In the context of the UN, you might begin there, but then you can work with the funds and programs, then you can work with the specialized agencies. What is clear in my mind is that if governments come to the UN and say, look, could you help us address this multidimensionality problem, we better get prepared for that, because that issue is certainly going to come. Third aspect, what the 2030 Agenda says is, if I can synthesize it, you need integrated policies to deal with multidimensional problems. If the problem is multidimensional, you need integrated policies. Since the problems are multidimensional, you need integrated policies. But what does integrated policies mean? Well, we've used a lot of words to deal with this problem. We say that different types of policies are interactive, are mutually supportive, should be coordinated, should be coherent, are interdependent. And you can go on and on. That's the type of language we've used in the past. Not to too much success, but that's the language we've used. What we're now saying is, look, you better converge. This is about different areas of policy converging. At the widest level, economic, social, and environmental need to converge. And within each one of the specific areas or the specific detail of a policy, you're going to converge. It's a totally new mindset. It's a completely new mindset. And it's very complicated to do because we are all educated sectorially. Probably the last time one could see some sort of integrated education was if you went to a school, that had one professor, one teacher that sort of taught 5 or 6 different things, which does occur, at least in developing countries. We know that can happen. But from then on, you specialize. You specialize. And then you specialize in an area, you specialize in your profession or your technical knowledge. And then the system is organized that way. You have ministries, the UN is organized. Everything is organized sectorially. And suddenly we're told now, scrap that way of looking at the problem. You need to integrate. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. It's not something that you simply say, so we can repeat as long as we want, integrated, and it's all over the place. The fact is, there's no country, I think, that can come around and tell any of us, saying, look, I know how to do it. This is what we have been doing for the last 10 years, and look how it works. As a whole, as a development process, or in the purely social, or in the purely environmental. So it's an enormous challenge. But the UN is about that. It's about being, looking ahead of the game, proposing something absolutely extraordinary, which is the 2030 agenda. In a very, very, very confused world, for you, the 193 governments of the UN to come up with the 2030 agenda is quite surprising, to say the least. And yet, it was done. Yet you did it. Now we have the problem of, having the capacity, having our capacities to be up to the ambition that is in the 2030 agenda. But frankly speaking, I find that to be a fascinating challenge. A world uncertain of where it's going is suddenly told by you, the UN, through the UN method of negotiation, that we should all move towards a sustainable development vision, and that is possible. Now we have to address the obstacles and the complications of doing that. The fourth aspect, I mentioned it en passant at the beginning, is this is going to be very different in different countries. And we will have to see what sort of things we can put together globally and what sort of things we have to do in the regions. And I believe that all that has to do with exchanging experiences is probably going to work better if we do it first at the regional level. If we want to see, well, how is it that these multidimensional, integrated things, etc., need to be done, there's something to be done globally, and that's why I mentioned DESA. But certainly, by the time we get to the nitty-gritty, the regions are going to be important. But I think that one thing is also key. The regions are all very different. So we better go at it region by region. But this goes against the instinct of the UN, in which let's tell all the regional commissions how they should do this. No, we can't tell all regional commissions how they should do this. Nor you can tell UNDP how to do this. UNDP will have to see by region and by country because they're there. And the future resident coordinators that the Secretary General is promoting, rightly so. So let's go region by region. It's going to be easier. It's going to be better. And this takes me to the high-level political forum. It's an interesting animal, but it has its problems. It's interesting because it sort of upgrades the discussion. But in a moment in which you have a sustainable development goals that have an environmental, social, and economic footing, dimension, it actually eliminated the Commission on Sustainable Development and replaced it by the forum. But the forum has become much more, and very interesting and necessarily so, a place where countries come and report on what they're doing in the 2030 agenda. But in the process, you lost the technical discussion. You don't have a technical discussion in the high-level political forum. The technical discussion was in the Commission, the equivalent of this one. And in the process, that was lost. We have to see how is it, not the thinking because the people are still there, but the intergovernmental dialogue is not there. So we will need to see how is it that we rearrange this to make sure that the three pillars, and the question will have to be, well, where is it that we discuss the economic pillar? In a UN context, from a UN perspective, from the logic with which we produced Agenda 2030, that same logic has to apply to the three components. How is it that we discuss the economic side of it? Big challenge, big obstacle if we're not able to solve this well. Fifth element is something that the Secretary General has proposed, and I want to just make a comment on it, which is to have a system-wide strategic document addressed to the EU that can help organize the work of the United Nations development system. I think that this document brings together what I'm saying. It brings together in whichever manner we want to advance in understanding the economic dimension of sustainable development. It brings together the social dimension, whose backing, whose underlying UN decisions are there, in the environmental, the regional, if we want to do that. So yes, is a strategic document, a system-wide strategic document possible? Yes. Yes, it is. Oriented towards the United Nations development system. But in order for that to work, you need to do previous work within the UN system. You can't suddenly say out of the blue now you're going to produce a strategic policy document, because some components of it, some parts of it need to be refined much further. Let me finalize with two comments. The future of this commission, I think it's extremely important. It's no more, no less than the social dimension of sustainable development. I mean, it couldn't be more important. So whichever way you go about it, you of course have to make sure that this, which has been an essential foundation of the work of the UN, is now translated from the Social Summit into the 2030 Agenda, and that it continues to have the weight and the importance that the new circumstances imply. But it supposes, the preparation of the work supposes that, DESA is no longer working in silos. So the Commission, the division in charge of doing this meeting will have to be looking sideways towards other parts of DESA to see how is it that we continue to have a Commission on Social Development that is charged with the social dimension of the 2030 Agenda, and at the same time, it's a Commission that contributes to the integration of the economic, the social, and environmental. I just pose the problem. It's perfect, from my point of view, perfectly feasible, but we cannot assume that all of the functional commissions are going to continue exactly in the same way. They need an adaptation to the reality, but this one, no doubt, has a fundamental aspect to do, and that's where I sort of miss the Sustainable Development Commission to do its technical work. I think that this commission has a very interesting opportunity to do this. And the opportunity is that the second committee has requested to the Secretary General to produce a system-wide plan of action for the eradication of poverty in this third decade of, we've had 2 decades for the eradication of poverty, this is the third one. And as part of the preparing that third decade, the Secretary General has said, look, the second committee has said, look, I would like to see the Secretary General prepare for us a system-wide action plan for the eradication of poverty. That, in fact, is what we're talking about. So suddenly now we have an instrument, which is, if that is going to be prepared, it's probably going to be prepared in DESA, and within DESA is going to be the Commission on Social Development will have a rather important aspect on it, because it has been the place where the poverty decades have been discussed, but it's totally different. It's a completely different approach. If you're going to have a system-wide, I don't want to go into the detail of how this can be done or where and in what manner, but I believe it's very important, and And you as delegates are going to have a pretty important task ahead, with a lot of imagination, a lot of creativity. And let me say one thing. When I was permanent representative here, together with some friends of ours at the time, I had a sort of a crazy idea, and I proposed that we should have a World Summit for Social Development. I was treated as crazy for a rather long time. But why did I propose this? Because I had been president of the third committee at the beginning of the 90s. And I was struck by the commitment that the delegates to the social issues had. How the delegates at the same time, were representing governments, but believed in the social issues that they were dealing with. And this is an extraordinarily important aspect of it. Delegates that believe in what they're doing. I don't want anybody of you to raise their hands, but I would bet that a majority of you representing governments in this room do not have instructions for this meeting. You have general instructions, but you didn't receive a brief for what you were going to do in the Commission on Social Development. Maybe a couple of countries which we know which they can be receive that brief. So your role is absolutely essential. Because yes, you have a direction and you understand the interests of your countries. But the capacity to make things happen or to block them finally winds up in your own hands. It's not so much the capital. We sometimes say, well, I have to consult the capital when we're negotiating to give yourself time. But in the end, it's very much in your hands. So I just want to mention this to say that all of these questions that are rather complicated and complex and that many of them may pass through your hands is going to make you, as delegates, play a very fundamental role in trying to find, what are the best ways of, addressing these issues. And finally, let me say that in all of the documentation related to the 2030 agenda and in the UN in general, we systematically talk about the need for participation, for consultation, for this has to go beyond governments to society, to all different types of stakeholders, etc. And that, I believe, is absolutely essential. Doing this by also empowering people to be part of this is absolutely basic. And it's related to a process underway in the world, which is not the UN process. It's that representative governance, that is, that you go and vote and every so many years, it's in crisis. The relationship between people and the political structures of the world is weak, and you have an enormous amount of different data to confirm that. So that the participatory governance, the notion that somehow citizens have to be part of the way these things are done, and not just consult, and that whoever is consulting does whatever those persons want, but you actually play a role in defining a policy, play a role in making that policy happen, implementing it, and probably play a role in evaluating whether the policies are well done or not. These are things that are coming. I'm not going to say that these are going to happen tomorrow, but we better all get prepared, because this search for participatory government together with representative governance is something that is going to come upon us. And let me say something that I would have said at the beginning, except that you probably would not have understood. In this issue of empowerment, I would put absolutely at the heart and center of it gender equality. Gender equality, dealing with the issues of women and all, I won't go into the detail of it, dealing with that issue is, not probably, is the most important decision that we can all take together. Many of them have been taken, and that we can all pursue, in our own realities. I have no doubt about that, and I think it's absolutely essential that we take it that way. Why I'm saying it the way I would have, is said so often. And by the way, It's very important that we keep women's issues and gender equality on the whole in the midst. I cannot end a speech without saying, by the way, we have to. That is the tradition. That's the way you do it, unless it's an issue that has to do with women. If I had said that at the beginning, you would have looked at me and said, what is he saying? So I'm using the usual format, which is to say it at the end, and by the way, to say this is at the heart of the whole thing. This is of the essence, and that needs to be acknowledged. And it cannot be said, well, you know, this is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go into the detail because we know in how many different ways you can sideways the discussion of these issues. And with what I would like to finish is to say that this question of empowering people to be part of the process, it's not a mechanical thing. It's because you respect people, because you understand that the dignity and the value of the human being is absolutely essential. That we need to approach fragility and vulnerability and the need of others to be assisted who have not lost their dignity because of the situation in which they find themselves. And they do not feel to be a statistic when sometimes it becomes so obvious that in many ways they have become statistics. You know, we need to know how to look, how to perceive, how to feel, and never say, I understand how you feel, because we will never, ever understand the way they feel. But we can ask ourselves whether we feel, and in the end reach the conclusion which, in order to understand, you have to feel. I mean, not it's like a mechanical exercise. And the dangers of mechanical exercise on an issue of such deepness as the issues of poverty are extremely, extremely dangerous. And let me leave you with a thought. Why am I saying these things in this manner? Because something that I won't say that we forget, because normally this is not thought about. But the fact is that we all carry poverty in our DNA. Everybody in this room comes from a family that was once poor. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200, 500, 1,000, whatever it is. Every person in this room comes from a once poor family. And that is in our DNA. So that when we look at poverty, we have to be able to look at it as knowing that sometime, long time, short time, very, very long time ago, you know, this poverty issue came through the families that we come from. So all of this to say that you have an enormous job in front of you, a beautiful job in front of you, and I just wanted to take this occasion to stimulate you and to be with you and to be part of the sort of issues that you will have to be dealing with, which are momentous issues, and to look at it with the eyes of caring and with caring eyes. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank Mr. Juan Somavia very much for his wide-ranging and thought-provoking statement, and not least for highlighting the importance and potential in this commission. Thank you very much. I'd now, at this juncture, like to pass over to Ms. Jane Barrett, our moderator today, to conduct the proceedings of the panel discussion. Ms. Barrett, all
Thank
yours.
you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was struck by the messages that His Excellency Somavia has just expressed to us. You know, on the one hand, he talked about the complexity of the 2030 agenda, it being transformative in its universality, its complexity and its integrated approach. You know, he clearly made the statement that poverty is a universal challenge, and this afternoon we're going to hear from 4 excellent speakers that will speak to the issue of the concrete strategies to reduce poverty. But I was equally struck by the words of fragility, of vulnerability, and not last but dignity. And the question that he asked each and every one of us, and that was, do we feel? And I think it's so easy in our daily work. We get caught up in, the projects and the policies that we forget that in 2013, 1 in every 10 people in the world was living in poverty on $1.90 per day or less. And 50% of those living in poverty lived in sub-Saharan, and 1/3 lived in Asia. So it strikes me that when we're listening to the speakers today from Costa Rica, Egypt, Germany, and then at the heart of homelessness, we need to just reflect on who we are as distinguished representatives and better understand how we can take some of these strategies that will be expressed and look at them in terms of scalability, transferability, and also replication. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, and that is Her Excellency Ms. Ana Helena Chacon, Vice President of Costa Rica. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you.
Just a few moments ago, I spoke about the UNDP 2016 report and the fact that human development focuses on the value of human lives and not on the value of economies. This quite clearly shows that the mandate we have is to invest in people, to give people back their dignity through opportunities, through greater freedoms, and through effective enjoyment of human rights. And like Juan, I would add, if policies are going to have human development at the heart of matters, then gender equality needs to be there as too, because 50% of the world is still not living on an equal footing, and that's happening in many of our countries. And that is why I believe that the urgent principle of ensuring dignity is part of SDG number 1, and that is to put an end to poverty in all its forms throughout the world. This has been our framework for action and our reference point for our policies and our work in the case of Costa Rica, which we have undertaken when we took office 4 years ago. This is a major objective, and I believe, if you'll allow me the expression, it should be something that flows through, that floods all of our public policies and all of our efforts in our countries. The world is full of inequalities as never before. There is hunger, exclusion, and poverty in all of its urgent and violent forms, and therefore there is an urgent need to work towards achieving the SDGs and Agenda 2030. For example, in Costa Rica, we signed a pact with all of these sectors of society. If we want to achieve equality and poverty eradication, we have to have other sectors involved, not just the government, civil society, academia, NGOs, and others. We believe that this matter is important for other countries in the world as well. We are not all as committed as we should be in achieving this objective. Since we are focusing primarily on human rights in the government I represent, we established one of our policies from the outset, namely to reduce poverty. And in 2015, we created a national strategy for poverty reduction called Bridge to Development. We have 4 basic strategies. We have social maps, firstly to determine where the greatest concentration of poverty and extreme poverty in the country is. And then we have the multidimensional poverty index. We include this measurement to measure overall poverty, not just poverty in economic terms. We measure access families have to education, to health, to housing, to employment, and to social protection. And in that way, we know what the root causes are which lead families into poverty. And we have been the first country in the world to set up a table in order to distribute the limited resources that we have in our country. We have budgeted our funding through this multidimensional poverty approach. And in this way, we can send the funding where it will do the most good. Then we have social managers. These are individuals who are very important in this entire chain. They are the ones who go out and find families living in extreme poverty, living in exclusion, because they don't know how institution works. They don't know which doors to knock on. And they have to go tell 10 or 15 people in 15 different institutions what their suffering is. But with a single individual, they establish a family plan and they address the greatest needs. And then we have a single registry which enables us to look at all of the variables in 13 institutions. And in this way, we are able to provide greater assistance. We've achieved considerable results through this strategy. In the past 2 years, we have reduced overall poverty from 22.4% to 20%, but we have reduced extreme poverty to 5.7%. That's the most important element. By measuring the multidimensional nature of poverty in 2015, we've been able to drop the level of poverty from 21.8% to 18.8%. Oxford University assisted us. Amartya Sen received the Nobel Prize for these efforts. We are quite clear as to not just how to measure poverty, but how to manage it, because poverty doesn't just mean a lack of funding, but it means a lack of training, of human capital. And that is why we have made progress in ensuring human rights. Without the action of these efforts, the action of the state would be pointless, and we would not be ensuring the well-being of all peoples. We are helping to build skills, and in order to do that, we need to educate, 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 so that we can break with and put an end to all of the outdated models of assistance which previously dealt with poverty through palliative measures without really eradicating it. I'm certain that the end to extreme poverty is something that we can achieve in our respective countries when we have the appropriate policies, when we go to individuals directly and without using any kind of conditional subsidies. And finally, we've implemented a solid methodology based on technical criteria, which has been recognized nationally and internationally. We carry out this policy with a great deal of transparency and accountability, and we earmark resources for these social policies, and we meet the needs of the people who require it the most. I hope that people can hear our story, can learn from us. I hope that we can exchange views, our experience. In all of our countries, we believe that we can learn from each other And we believe that this would be an incentive to work towards a common human development for our countries, so that in 2020 we will not regret the fact, as we did in 2015, that we have not achieved the SDGs. Thank you.
Before going on to the next speaker, Madame, I was struck by the very clear, targeted strategy of Costa Rica. You know, the 4, what seems to be very simple steps, and yet you've underpinned it, you know, with human rights, with respect for the dignity of individuals, and I like the phrase education, education and education. So I look forward to further discussion with when we finish the other speakers. But I think many member states could actually take comfort in those 4 steps, because I could see that they could be replicated. So thank you, Madam.
Thank you.
I would like to now introduce Her Excellency Dr. Gaida Wali, Minister of Social Solidarity of Egypt.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. It's been quite interesting to listen to Mr. Somavia speak about the obstacles, and then listen to Her Excellency, the Vice President of Costa Rica, taking those obstacles into consideration, and yet defining a very clear program to move towards eradication of poverty. I will share with you very quickly a PowerPoint presentation, a few slides to share with you some of the challenges that I believe we have faced for the last 4 years, but I believe are taking place and are similar to many of the challenges facing other countries in the world. In Egypt, poverty is mostly rural, and it's mostly in Upper Egypt. We have been suffering from very slow economic growth rates and very high inflation rates. The issues and the obstacles and the challenges facing us are the efficiency of the social protection system. There was a social protection system, but it was not well targeted, and it was not very much integrated. Also, a very high percentage of increase in population and very high density with high levels of malnutrition also in Upper Egypt. The story in Egypt is a story of regional disparities to a great extent. Early marriages, low or inexistent female unemployment, where we have employment among men is much higher than employment among women. Efficiency of the institutions and the organizations and the ability to implement the development programs, and coordinating different efforts to address poverty. So actually we have used a number of strategies to first put in place some policies for social protection, but also for economic development, and we see them very much related. So we used the cash transfers, and very important here was to really do very quick coverage of 100% of the villages in the country, with a focus when it comes to distribution of resources to the poorest villages. Women and children were the focus of our different programs, be it in education, increasing enrollment of girls and making them stay longer years in schools, giving the access to cash to women. Also starting for the first time a database, a unified database of the poor. People who come and register, ask for social services, whether they are eligible or not. We started a very large database, and now we have 25 million individuals in this database. This database comprises of the different dimensions of poverty. So it tells us about people's education, health condition, housing condition, any diseases in the family, sources of income, and so on. So it was very important to develop this profile and this database and avail it and analyze it all the time. Using technology for development, I think, is another strategy that is very important. So it's not about cash, it's not about information, but it's also using technology to reach people and for different purposes, not just reach and roll out, but also for good governance, to fight corruption, and train many researchers, specialists, field workers. Those reached 22,000 in just a couple of years. The enrollment started very slow in our programs, but then increased very quickly. The numbers here are important. We're speaking up there about 5 million families. Not all of them have received the transfers, but the 5 million families are all on our database, and we know what are the different needs. So knowing the population and identifying their needs is very important. Increasing the cash transfer and making people receive the money so that you build credibility and they know you are there for them. It's very important to announce all the time that you are targeting the poorest, and you are going geographically to the poorest areas and those places that were denied development for years. Also, these are the numbers that we keep communicating to the people, that 3/4 of the money is going to the rural Upper Egypt governorates, and that they're going to women, and that they're going to the elderly and the disabled. Housing is a very important element where it has a direct link to people's and health and living conditions. So improving housing conditions is not just to make people live in dignity, but because it is very much related to connecting families to water and sanitation. When you connect people to water and sanitation, you are directly investing in their health, and you are enabling them to have a better health, and then invest in their training, in their education, and make them more employable. Connection to natural gas in terms of improving access to natural gas in villages, which was only available in urban areas, is also a very big program. The disabled and how we help them. Fair trade and handicrafts, and how we can reach the poorest villages and have in different villages different products where women can produce in houses and can become a source of income and can train and trade very efficiently. Financial inclusion is very important. The poor do not have access in Egypt, did not have access to many of the financial services, be it insurance, be it transfers, be it credit, be it any financial service that the rich need and the rich have, the poor did not have. It was very important as part of our strategy to focus on financial inclusion and keep pushing throughout the country to use the different technologies available. In a country of 100 million where we have 100% penetration of mobile access to mobile phones, it is always an opportunity to reach people using mobile phones. The elderly are a big challenge still. Working on improving pensions and social insurance and the efficiency of the system is still a challenge that we are working on with partners such as ILO and other agencies. Just to make my presentation to sum it and to link it to what Mr. Somavia said, there are a set of criteria that I think we need to consider in any country where there are serious efforts to address poverty. I think safety, security, and stability are absolutely necessary. We will not be able to come when 2030 comes and judge different countries with the same rule if in some places people are displaced, if there are wars, if people are forced to migrate, if there are internal conflicts. It will be very difficult to really measure and really look fairly at different parts of the world. People need safety, security, and stability. Governments need safety, security, and stability, and societies need to feel safe in order to be engaged in development. Political commitment is very important. Political commitment not just at the heart of governments, but global commitment to really help population reach the 2030 agenda. Putting the right resources behind those programs and those strategies. And resources can be mobilized locally, but also regionally, and there is a role for international support in moving resources to the areas that have been denied development for years. Partnerships are very important. What type of partnerships within the country and between countries? Local partnerships, regional partnerships, partnerships between government and civil society, between civil society and the private sector, between communities. Partnerships are essential. And institutions. If we don't have have the right institutions in place, it will be very difficult to implement any of those strategies. Building capacities of institutions is very important, and I think is an important role that the UN can play in building capacities in different parts of the world and sharing knowledge. Good governance and transparency and introducing systemic changes is key if we want any development to be sustainable. So the story is a story of a constant fight against poverty, but it's a story that has many, many positive elements, and there are success stories in different parts of the world, and I think no one country should be left behind, no one country should be working alone, no one country should be reinventing the wheel, while many, many countries have very successful stories and very relevant stories. So I do think that for us such as this one, documents that we share, discussions that we have should not just keep on saying that we need to reach the 2030 agenda, that we need to do this and that, but get into the details of how we can do it, what type of resources, what type of partnerships we should get into to really address the issues of the poor, and to really say that we feel how they feel and that we really understand their plight. So thank you very much, and I hope that I didn't take more than the time given to me.
Minister, that was quite a masterful effort in 10 minutes. You know, you talked about a story, and what I heard in those vital minutes was many facets of a whole book. You know, you really touched on some of the complexity of this integrated approach that Egypt is embarking on. You know, these three words, safety, security and stability. But leading on from that, you talked about we must be safe to be engaged, and then to be engaged is then to be empowered. And so you really have developed a strong pathway that many of us need to reflect on. The other part which struck me was 100% penetration in a country with 100 million people. That is just phenomenal if you think of the capacity and capabilities to eradicate poverty. But equally, you know, good governance is at the heart of your strategy. So thank you very much indeed, Madam. I'd like to now move on to introduce Mr. Mark Kamperhoff, I beg your pardon, sir, Kamperhoff, Head of Unit EU Coordination and International Affairs, Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth, Germany. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. And thank you also for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here at the panel, and I'd like to begin by saying that I liked your really the storytelling aspect of this panel, and I would like to share with you some parts of the German story, actually in a very practical manner, what we did to, or what we are still doing, because it's really a long way also for us, of course, to implement the 2030 agenda. Germany is a leading industrial nation, and we want to play a pioneering role in implementing the 2030 agenda. So let me just present to you some of the key elements in a, as I said, really practical manner of what we do to implement. First, last year in January, we adopted our National Sustainable Development Strategy, and it entered into force just 1 year ago. It really defines concrete national goals and measures for the entire spectrum of political topics, and thus it brings the SDGs to a very practical level in Germany. Let me perhaps give you an example when it comes to poverty, to combating poverty in Germany. What does it mean? Actually, in Germany, we follow not an absolute concept of poverty, but a relative concept. That means that for us, people are at risk of poverty when their actual income is below 60% of the median income in Germany, the median and not the medium income. Germany, on the one hand, has a strong economy, and our unemployment rate has recently dropped to around about 5%. But besides this material aspect, and this has also been touched upon by Mr. Somavia already, poverty, of course, is multidimensional and can also be reflected by limited access to education, social discrimination and exclusion, And last but not least, also a lack of participation in decision-making. And all of that makes poverty eradication a very important goal for Germany. Actually cutting in half the share of people that, according to the definition I mentioned, live in poverty is an essential goal for us. Then when it comes to jobs, I think we're also in line with the international perspective, because we are convinced that the most effective means to avoid poverty is to have a job that assures a decent livelihood. For this, an important step in combating poverty in Germany was our introduction of the minimum wage in 2015. Still, a decent wage can only protect from poverty if people can actually work sufficiently to make a living according to their needs. So it's not just the minimum wage as such, but the needs of the people also. Moreover, the way how people of working age actually work has an impact on people of different ages and generations. As an example, children are much better protected from poverty if their parents are gainfully employed. Older people then are protected from poverty if they have been able to provide for their own retirement in the course of their lives. And last but not least, women who have taken long career breaks due to their family responsibilities or who have worked part-time for a long time run a greater risk of becoming poor. Thus, an important means against poverty for us in Germany is the reconciliation of family and working life, and that for both parents, not only for women. So how do we do this? The promotion of the reconciliation. As one example, in 2007, so almost 10 years ago, the parental allowance has been introduced and is compensating for a part of the income which is no longer earned when father or mother limit their professional activity after the birth of the child. Actually, in practice, this allowance arises to round about 65% of the last income. Here, low-income families receive particular financial benefits. Then in 2015, we rendered this system, the parental allowance system, more flexible. Now the parental allowance plus system promotes an earlier return to the workplace and part-time. And this is actually the path that we want to continue on, making the combination of part-time work and family obligations easier. Then another aspect is people providing care, because people providing care to their relatives receive financial support, and just like family obligations, caring must not be a reason to give up one's job and to fall into a risk of poverty. Another example regarding the young generation. Another important focus of our work is combating child poverty. In fact, 1 out of 5 children in Germany is threatened by poverty. And children who have grown up in difficult economic situations unfortunately still have fewer educational opportunities in Germany and more often suffer from health restrictions. Poverty during childhood means fewer prospects for the future and then a higher risk for the next generation to also remain poor. And we want and we have to fight this danger of poverty that is being passed on from one generation to the other and thus will never or will likely to never end. And here, one means for us is sound childcare services and facilities as really a precondition for a good start into life with equal opportunities. Therefore, our national sustainable development strategy that I just had just mentioned from 2017 has set itself 2 ambitious goals in the field of childcare. On the one hand, the share of babies aged up to 2 years in full-time childcare shall increase to 35% by 2030. And then for the 3 to 5-year-olds, the target is 70% by, again, 2030. And in order to help reach this goal, we introduced in August 2013 a right to a care place for every child in Germany from the age of 1. And then again, thanks to the financial support, more than 400,000 daycare places have been created in the last 10 years in childcare facilities and daycare for children under 3 years of age. So this is really developing also because we think that you can only reconcile your family obligations if also your child can be taken care of. in the end, the care rate for children under 3 years has now increased from 13 to 30% in the last year. Let me point out another focus group that is particularly affected by poverty, and that is children of single parents. Actually, 44% of single parents' households are at risk of poverty. This situation even gets worse when the child does not receive any financial support from the second parent, because he or she, in most cases it's a he, simply does not pay anything. So in this case, the child receives an advance payment by the state, and last year we actually expanded this advance payment, and single parents are now entitled to receive this advance payment longer than before, and not only for young children, but also for adolescents until the age of 18. And then to more or less conclude, I would also like to put a particular emphasis on the fact of gender equality. Now, what do we do for the particular situation of women? As you know, for women, long periods of involuntarily working part-time, lower wages, and poorer prospects of professional advancement really constitute a danger of material poverty, but also discrimination as regards cultural, societal, political participation. They also constitute a form of poverty. In Germany, men and women enjoy equal rights. This is guaranteed by our basic law, and it's our explicit task as a state to eliminate any form of discrimination. Now, it's of course positive that the female employment rate is constantly on the increase, and is now, it has just exceeded 74% actually in Germany, but still women receive an average hourly wage which is 21% lower than that of men. And this gender pay gap clearly constitutes a form of discrimination. Therefore, in our Sustainable Development Strategy, the federal government has set itself a target to lower this gender pay gap, and it should not exceed 10% in 2030. So it would still be there, but it would be half of the gap at least. And then to give you some other examples in this domain, already over the past few years, we have substantially improved the situation for women, also in other ways. There is the minimum wage that empowers women in low-income professions. Then we adopted an act on equal participation of women and men in leadership positions in the private and the public sectors that obliges companies to set quotas and thus provides for more women in executive and non-executive positions. And we have just adopted a new Equal Pay Transparency Act that will empower women to better assert their claim to equal pay for work of equal value, because there will be a comparative table that you can ask for in order to see what actually your fellow colleagues earn at your same level, men and women, but in practice it more or less, in most cases, affects women. So maybe just a few remarks to conclude. Combating poverty is closely linked with peace, economic development, and environmental sustainability. These challenges can only be met through international cooperation. And the fact that we have all cut extreme poverty in half since 1990 has shown that the world has accepted these challenges. Reaching the first of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals would send out a strong global signal. So we think that it's really up to us, to every country on its own, but also the countries of the world together. And the CSocD has an important role to play in this regard and really needs to fulfill this mandate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kamperhoff. What struck me in each of the three presentations is the emphasis on gender equality, regardless of what country speakers are coming from. Also, Mark, the issue of decent livelihood, and I think that's a phrase that was a theme at ECOSOC, the Commission, not so long ago. This decent work, decent livelihood. But also in Germany, the focus on reconciliation of work and family life. So we're actually coming back to respect the importance of family life and that balance. What did strike me, though, is your emphasis about future generations of people in poverty. And then the statistic about 44% of single parents have children who may be at risk of poverty. And so, Germany is focusing not only on how to eradicate poverty in situ, with the definition that you talked about, at risk below the median, but also future generations. So I look forward to further discussion. We now go to our final speaker, and we're really going to the heart of the issue, aren't we? We're really going to those people that are in poverty when we listen to Mr. Mark McGreevy, OBE, Group Chief Executive of DePaul International and the founder of the Institute of Global Homelessness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to speak at this event. Thanks also to the Vincentian family of NGOs here at the UN who represent the membership of 2 million people globally working to end poverty in 151 countries for creating this opportunity for me. In consideration of our shared commitment through the 2030 Agenda to leave no one behind, I would like to make the case for street homeless people across the world as a population that is indeed at risk of being neglected. I realise that the word homelessness itself has a much broader application than those just living on the streets. We might include refugees, internally displaced people, slum dwellers, for example. And I also realise that these populations sometimes overlap. However, with those caveats in place, I can think of no more powerful image of global poverty than homeless people living and sleeping on the streets of our major towns and cities. This is not a new problem. However, our work at the Institute of Global Homelessness, based at DePaul University in Chicago, points to the fact that unsheltered homelessness is growing in many parts of the world for a multitude of reasons, and that this group is in danger of being overlooked in the battle to eradicate poverty. Unsheltered homelessness affects all groupings, men and women, families with children, youth, the elderly, people with disabilities. It occurs in most nations, wealthy and poor, across the globe. It has severe negative impacts on both individuals and on cities. I'd like to say that we have a firm understanding of the size and scale of this issue globally, but definitions of homelessness vary from country to country, and data collection is either poor or non-existent in many parts of the world. The last global guesstimate of street homelessness came in 2001 in a report from the UN Human Settlements Programme, and it suggested that there were 100 million people who have no access to housing or shelter in any shape or form. In truth, we just don't know. We don't measure it. It's very likely that that figure is much higher. What we do know is that shelter and housing are the foundation stones for dignified, decent and rewarding lives. Shelter and housing are crucial if people are to reach their full potential and to address other causes and extreme effects of poverty. There's evidence from across the world that street homelessness dramatically affects people's health and mental health, and it makes them more difficult to access employment or receive services that might help to lift you out of poverty. All in-country research available points to the fact that street homeless people have a shorter life expectancy than those who are sheltered. One of our partners calls street homelessness a death-inducing poverty. Street homeless populations vary from country to country and even from city to city. However, it's always the case that they are people who are in vulnerable situations or who face discrimination. For example, in the US, homelessness is particularly high amongst the LGBTQ youth and people of colour. In Australia and Canada, disproportionate numbers of people who identify as Indigenous or Aboriginal experience homelessness. In India, people of lower caste are more likely to live on the street. If the 2030 Agenda focus is on solutions to poverty for people in vulnerable situations who face additional discrimination, then we almost certainly need to include solutions for people experiencing street homelessness. Further, street homelessness intersects directly with several of the indicators for SDG 1. For example, people who are street homeless are often unable to access basic services and are especially vulnerable to climate-related events. However, any measurement of street homelessness as an indicator of poverty in itself is missing from the SDGs, as is the concrete suggestion that countries tackle street homelessness as part of their national poverty reduction strategies. If we're serious that we want to make sure that no one is left behind, we must address these issues. Is it possible to reduce or even end street homelessness? The simple answer is yes. At the Institute of Global Homelessness, we're busy in gathering stories of how that's worked in practice, and we've just launched a campaign to work with 150 cities to end street homelessness in those cities by 2030. The city of Medicine Hat in Canada recently achieved functional zero with regard to homelessness. In the UK, the government-backed Roof Sleepers initiative reduced street homelessness by 2/3 between 1999 and 2002. In Finland, the national programme to reduce long-term street homelessness, PARVO, is close to eliminating street homelessness completely in that country. In addition to these clear examples of reductions or even ending street homelessness, there are other promising examples where government and civil society have come together to gather better data and drive down street homelessness in countries as diverse as Chile, Vietnam and Uruguay. What all of these stories have in common is a clear goal or target agreed across this city or country, a well-coordinated system that plans for outcomes and gathers reliable data, a citywide or national strategy that weaves together prevention, emergency response and housing and support, and crucially, resources to support this work and to provide an adequate supply of safe, affordable accommodation or shelter. I believe we can take those lessons and apply them in a global context. There are two things that could happen in this room which would help make a difference. Firstly, and simply, we could suggest that existing national poverty reduction strategies also focus on reducing or eliminating street homelessness. The second is more complicated. Could we think about a measurable indicator of street homelessness within the current SDGs, using a shared vocabulary? In 2015, the Institute of Global Homelessness developed a global framework on homelessness involving academics, policymakers and practitioners from over 30 countries. It's the first globally shared typology on homelessness and would allow comparative data to be gathered. A specific indicator in this area would be a catalyst to improve measurement of street homelessness by country-level agencies. Data that can be compared across regions would facilitate a global collaborative movement of leaders learning from one another. Within a city or a country, data reviewed on a regular basis can offer rapid feedback and inform effective local strategies. Finally, accurate measurement would help leaders working to end homelessness to advocate for the issue by demonstrating its magnitude and support. This measurable indicator on street homelessness within the SDGs is aligned with existing UN agreements and declarations. The SDGs and Habitat 2 and Habitat 3 agendas each include some version of a goal to provide adequate shelter for all, to provide adequate housing for all, or to improve the lives of people who are homeless. However, these goals and declarations either do not mention unsheltered homelessness as indicators of progress, or do not have a clear goal or measurement to prompt action to allow for accountability. A very straightforward correction would be to include an indicator for Goal 1 or Goal 11 of the SDGs related to the proportion of the urban population without shelter. In whatever follows the SDGs, we would recommend going further by including an end to unsheltered homelessness as a target in itself. So, to summarise, despite known solutions on every continent, people live with no housing or permanent shelter, which negatively impacts both individuals and cities. My hope that is in 2030, if not sooner, we see a concrete commitment to end unsheltered homelessness take centre stage with a clear plan to measure and track progress. Let's not leave anyone behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGreevy. Mark, you know, what struck me is the importance of data and the different definitions, you know, depending on the country. And this issue of data has actually been mentioned in every one of the presentations. You know, in the first presentation, Madame, you know, you talked about a registry, and I think similarly in Egypt, and I guess Mark in Germany as well. You know, I think before we open the floor up to questions, could we actually just have a think about, you know, to what degree, you know, is age-related data going to be important to understand targeting, you know, different subpopulations? So perhaps one of the speakers could respond to that, and after that we can open the floor up. So,
thank you. Thank you, Madam. Hacer política pública basada.
To carry out public policies based on evidence means that public policy will have a real impact on the people that we want to reach. When we are unable to measure or determine how many people are affected and where they live and what the various needs of those individuals are, then the public policy is not transparent, and it's a policy that then is being done with good intentions perhaps, but it is ineffective, and that is why it's important to have the data. And I did want to refer to individuals who have been abandoned, street people. We don't have as much data on those individuals as we would like because they've been forgotten. That's why we haven't been able to carry out a direct policy to help these people. We do have policies on street people and people who are in hospitals, etc., because we are trying to reach those people, and I'd be happy to hear about your experience in that area as well. Thank you.
Minister?
I think it is very important to highlight this issue of information. And the information needs to be accurate, reliable, constantly updated, and needs to be shared. So not just any information, but the quality of information is important. In Egypt, we don't have homelessness, but we have street children, and we have them in large numbers. And we were asked as a Ministry of Social Development, Social Solidarity to start a program, and we were struck by the fact that we do not have information. The numbers and the estimates ranged between 200,000 to 2 million. So the range was huge. We couldn't plan or even ask for resources from the Ministry of Finance. So we had to do a survey. And this survey, we used thousands of researchers who went at midnight, the same hour in every single town and township in the whole country for 48 hours, because this is a phenomenon where you can have the same child move from a place to another and use different names. They would never trust you to give you their names or where they stay. So we finally were able to develop a map and put it on GIS, and then we planned a program for homeless children, street children. And these street children, we also had to have deeper information about them and divide them in two groups. Those who had families and those who have no idea where is their family or who are their families and do not have any identity. So we are using mobile units that go around the cities, and we have identified the 10 governorates where 80% of the phenomena exists, and with the help of 20 different NGOs, we are investing in attracting those kids through mobile units, putting them into institutions that are open so that they come in and come out, but where they can be fed, where they can be educated, they can be trained, and most important, to develop for them the necessary IDs and papers that would allow them to be mobile, to find different opportunities. So I think different groups will require different interventions that are designed differently, but for any intervention, for any vulnerable group, we need information, and governments should invest in information and really build this capacity of constantly collecting information. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. McGreevy?
In the world of homelessness, we collect data in two ways. We have something which is called a point-in-time count, which is going out maybe once a year at the same time and counting homeless populations in place. And that gives us an idea of the size and scale. But if we really want to tackle the poverties that are at the heart of this, then we do something called a by-name list. We sit down and interview those people on the streets and try to find out how they got there, which agencies they've been working with, what they really need to get out of their poverty. So I think there are different ways of approaching this issue. I think that sometimes we already have the data, we just don't have our databases linked up, you know, within health departments, within social services, that the data is out there, but we have nothing that integrates and gives us a real picture of people who are out there.
I'd like to now open the floor for the questions and comments to the panellists. Delegations are invited to press the buttons on their speaking consoles that look similar to a smiley face. Good, good. To ask for the floor. So I now open the floor for questions and comments. I call on the Minister of State for Family and Youth Affairs of Hungary. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for this very, very interesting panel, and everything what you said and your stories, they were very interesting. I would like to have a comment, and of course I cannot and won't tell the Hungarian story in 4 minutes, but I would like to underline just one element, and this is work. This is work, the importance of work, and just as in the SDGs, the decent jobs, how important work is, because I think that work is much more than only a mean to manage or only a mean to make money. It is much more. Work is also a mentality, work is also a way of living, work is also an example for the children. And I have to tell you the Hungarian example where there was a whole generation of people growing up without ever seeing their parents going to work. So children experience that day by day their parents lived at home and stayed at home and didn't go to work. So that was their lifetime experience. And this generation growing up didn't have an idea about going to work. And this had very, very bad consequences in the long run as well. So that's why we put an emphasis in Hungary in our policies on work and on promoting work and on giving working opportunity for people. And if we talk about poverty, of course, there are many definitions of poverty. There is this ROP and other definitions and numbers. But there is also a way of measuring poverty when we look at the households with very low work intensity. And I would just like to highlight the numbers in Hungary in this manner. That means that in 2012, the number of households or the percentage of households living with very low work intensity in Hungary was over 10%. It was actually 10.4%. And with the introduction of measures making it possible for more and more people to work in Hungary, we could lower this number to 2016 to 4.9%. So that means that in 2010, it was over 10%, and now it is below 5%. So it's already the half of the number 4 years before. And I think that's also that's already a great result. And if we look at minors living in households where nobody works, if we look at that number, in 2011, it was the highest. It was 17%. So 17% of the minors lived in households where nobody actually worked. And now this number in 2016 was 8.2%. So that means also that we could reach some results in this manner. And if we look at employment rates, actually, then we see that the unemployment rate, when it was the highest in Hungary in the last decade, it was over 12%, and now it is 4%. So that also means that the majority, or in general, the Hungarian people now have the opportunity to work. And just to mention one element, one measure, one mean is that also the public work scheme. That means that for those people who before lived only from social subsidies, now have the possibility, have the opportunity to work. And I think that most of the times the problem of poverty is not the problem of the individual, but it's the problem of the family. It's the problem of the family. And I think that we can fight poverty by giving decent work, decent jobs, and by empowering people with, of course, education and work. So I would like to also hear your comments on that and the importance of giving working opportunities for people. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think what you've just described to the delegations here are some very concrete strategies that Hungary has put in place. One of the areas that you really highlighted is work in a different sense. You know, it's a way of living, it's modelling children, and it does speak to Mr. Kamperhoff's comments about generational poverty. Would you like to comment on Minister's intervention?
Yes, thank you very much. I would just like to comment that I kind of found ourselves also in the different, I mean, we have the same goals in a way and the same objective. It's about decent work, but if you want to have, I mean, first you need a job, or you want a job, but not only a job for the job, but also for a decent living. You want to live or be able to live upon this job. And then also for people who may want to have other obligations, if you want to take care about, or you have to take care of a elderly, dependent family member or of young children, you have to have the choices also. So it's really a policy mix that makes it work on your own, according to your own needs, and not only having the objective of having a job, like just one job. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now call on the Director General of Evaluation and Monitoring of Social Programs at the Ministry for Social Development of Mexico.
Bueno. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. We would like to thank the UN for giving us the reports that we have before us, and undoubtedly they will be a useful guide as we continue with our work. For the Government of Mexico, sustainable development and our efforts to combat extreme poverty are among our national priorities. We would like to share the strategy that Mexico has undertaken over the past 5 years, which is reflected in the comments we made this morning, and also our commitments to the Copenhagen Sustainable Development Goals and the SDGs. Mexico is convinced that the SDGs are the greatest asset to have a more prosperous planet, but extreme poverty and the consequences continue to be the major challenge. We believe that dialogue will continue to guide us to ensure better well-being for the most vulnerable groups in our societies. In terms of health, the Government of Mexico recognizes that the vulnerable need to be supported. We have therefore invested considerably in the medical infrastructure in our country, and in the past 2 years, 7.8 million people have benefited from the medical program, particularly the elderly. We have therefore reduced their access or improved their access to medical care. Social security, health, and prosperity of vulnerable groups is a major issue throughout Latin America. Despite these challenges, we are carrying out cross-cutting activities and improving national inclusion through incentives. And in the past 2 years, we have reached historical lows in terms of employment. We would recognize that in order to break the intergenerational component of poverty, we need to have the appropriate tools, and that should be guiding us in the future. Our program, Prosperity, is making improvements in our country to ensure that more people can enter the labor market and can become productive members of society and generate income. This is true as well for the elderly who wish to re-enter the labor force. We need to invest in our vulnerable groups and the elderly so that we can ensure sustainable development. Today, we are committed to achieving results, in particular in Mexico, and thanks to the analysis that we have done that we can share with you, we hope that we will meet this goal. We are including beneficiaries in our social policies, in improving their ability to make to have incomes. Thank you.
Before I invite the distinguished representative from Costa Rica, could I invite delegations who have pressed their button to re-press their button, because our system up here has actually just deleted some of them. So if you have pressed it, could you press it again? So thank you. I invite the distinguished representative for Costa Rica.
Sí, muy buenas.
Good afternoon. I'm Selene Vialta from the National Council for the Elderly. We need, if we don't wish to leave anyone behind, we must also take on board people who suffer from dementia and Alzheimer's. We have to help reintegrate these people into their communities. We must not be institutionalizing these people. We have to replace that concept. And so to do that, we have to educate the population, reduce and not stigmatize these people so that they can be reintegrated into society. Many of these people live in poverty and extreme poverty. Have you taken these people into account in your programs? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madame. Call on now the distinguished representative from El Salvador.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, moderator. Let me begin by thanking all of the panelists for their comments today. They've been spot on. And I'd like to refer specifically to the statement made by Mr. Somavia. You basically summed up the statement which my country had prepared for item 3A. Thank you for calling on all of our delegations to ensure that this commission can achieve concrete results. In particular, this year, as we review these policies, we want this commission to remain relevant, and we believe that in order to do that, we should look at legally binding instruments following on the results of the Copenhagen summit, and that this commission should really be bolstering its own efforts. I'd like to touch on the issue of multidimensional poverty, in particular in middle-income countries, such as my own. We still face a number of challenges, in particular in maintaining the achievements we have gained so that people do not fall back into a cycle of poverty. And secondly, we've wanted to create a second generation of policies, such as referred to by Mr. Somavia, so that the labor sector recognizes these new needs and takes into account the entire life cycle of individuals. And we must have Agenda 2030 reflect the realities of our countries. In the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, we believe that this is the appropriate forum for discussing these issues, but it's certain that the UN as a whole must have a more comprehensive response in its follow-up to the agenda. because countries have been categorized based primarily on their income, and that categorization has affected the prioritization of official development aid. We would like to join our voice to others in this system. We believe that we should be making changes to the requirements, particularly for middle-income countries, so that we can overcome some of these issues. To Ms. Chacon, my country is particularly interested in Costa Rica's experience. The technical secretariat of in the President's office is already in touch with the Office for Human Development. And I do have a question to ask you. Has there been any assessment on the impact of prioritizing your policies and on changing your approach to overcoming poverty? Thank you.
Sí, muchísimas gracias por la.
Thank you very much for that question. In terms of assessment, we've carried out 3 evaluations. One was an evaluation of the process. The second was an impact assessment. And the General Controller of the Republic is now looking at how to address these issues. I can tell you that external evaluations are absolutely essential so that we can ensure transparency and objectivity to determine whether or not things are working. And I'd be very happy to share our results with you so that you can see what programs we've implemented. But it's very important to ensure social development through GDP, because it's true that some people fall back into poverty. We know who they are and why they fall back into poverty. But we should look with full transparency as to how we approach this issue. This is an ethical and political issue which governments need to address, because we can't just be looking at one of the causes of poverty when there are so many causes of poverty. We don't have a recipe, but we have to look at a number of issues when we take our decisions. So Costa Rica is certainly focused on this particular issue. And I would like to respond to Doña Zulema, who was the author of not institutionalizing the elderly. One decision that the government of Costa Rica took was not to set up any more institutions for the elderly. We don't want those people living in these institutions. We believe that it's the worst possible thing that we can do to the elderly. And so what we've done is to improve care within the families by providing caregivers so that the elderly, even if they have dementia or Alzheimer's or any other illness, we do that so that they can stay within the family. My forum is open to other countries of the world. We're respectful of human rights. As we saw this morning, we have an aging population, and we need to create other ways of caring for these individuals so that women are not just the ones who take on care for the elderly. This must be a social responsibility between men and women, including the state. We have to care for our elderly, and we need to care for our children so that they can enter the labor force, and we have to care for those with disabilities as well, because 90% of the caregivers in the world are women. And I recognize the work that Zulema has done in my country, and I hope that you will also take on the energy that she's expressed.
From Namibia.
Thank you, moderator. I think it was Mr. Simovia that has raised the issue of the realities, the economic realities in given countries. In Namibia, we have got one reality that we are faced with, and that's the informal economy. We have started to engage the informal economy, and we have realized that there are certain difficulties that is hard to overcome. One is the nomadic tendencies of these businesses. They're here today. Tomorrow when you go back, they are no longer there. The second issue is the issue of absence of reliable data, or personnel data, that can inform you as to the workforce and the condition of the workforce. So most of the time they're working under precarious conditions. And then the issue is how best one could ensure that these workers benefit from social protection. And this is becoming a hard reality that we have got so many difficulties. What I'm trying to find out is if there has been any successes or any successful outcomes from different countries with respect to the handling of the conditions of the workforce in an informal sector. Any given example or any given experience. Would appreciate it if we could be assisted in that regard, because we are convinced that those workers equally should also benefit from social protection measures that are available in the country, as those conditions are also leading to poverty at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I just put it back to the panel once again, because we're really asking about how do we gather data on people who are invisible to the system. That's what we're talking about. And I know in my world of family caregiving, you know, that's another so-called invisible group. So, Mark, would you like to comment on that? Because you did talk about data.
I think it's a very difficult issue, this, and certainly in some of the countries that we work in, some of our residents will be part of that workforce that they're involved in and earning money on the side for lack of benefits, for lack of other opportunities to do things, and that this group moves around a lot. I suppose there's two solutions. The first one is you police it, but that's not something I'm necessarily recommending in this sense. The other one, coming back to, I think, what Mark said earlier on, is this bit about creating opportunities for people to be involved in the legal workforce. And I think that the thing that our charity has as a mission statement is we say that you should have a place to call home and a stake in your community. And I think that feeling of opportunity and dignity, that chance to be involved in employment and training, is something that will bring people inside. But I have no easy answers on this. I think it's something that many, many countries struggle with.
Okay, thank you. I now call on the distinguished representative from Morocco.
Merci Madame la modératrice. Permettez-moi tout d'abord de remercier les distingués.
First, I'd like to thank the speakers for their presentations and for their relevant comments. And I'd also like to express my agreement with the analysis given by the Ambassador Juan Samavia, especially on the need to enable people to take part in any process, to empower people to be part of the process, and allow them to be empowered regarding eradication of poverty. In fact, it is this approach which my country has applied by adopting the National Initiative for the Human Development launched by His Majesty Mohammed VI, which allows for human capital to be the center of any development approach in order to reduce the disparities and inequalities economically. This initiative was called by the American Bank as the third best action program in the world. During the 10 past years, about 40 billion Moroccan currency units were invested in this program, and this has allowed for us 444,000 activities and projects for 10 million people, 50% of which live in rural areas. Mr. Chairman, my delegation believes that in order to guarantee promising prospects in terms of effectively combating extreme poverty, we need to have institutional guidance, which is really unified, without which these programs might really have a real deficiency in consistency. We see that in many countries, we often see there is a will and the policies are also there. But unfortunately, they are dispersed and widespread, thin, and there is not enough intervention because of various statutes in ministerial departments and specialized agencies for private actors. So consequently, we see that in spite of the reduction of the rate of poverty that we've observed in a given region or country, this has not allowed for the increase, this is rather called an increase of inequality among social strata, and the specific needs of people are not met. So we feel that the targeting is a relevant issue. The use of maps, for example, as mentioned by the Vice President of Costa maps with measure poverty in dimensional diversified form would be an excellent idea which enable us to measure the effectiveness of programs and targeting programs. The targeted programs should be given further consideration, as well as the poverty indices which correspond to social programs, the purchasing power of people, and the cost of living increases. Finally, poverty leads to risks of destabilization. It can cause social revolutions and be a fertile ground for terrorism. Without the eradication, we've seen many years now of priority objectives and cooperation of international guidance, but nevertheless countries in the South are still coping with the sustainable development challenges because that there is not an effective implementation of international commitments in this regard. The states in Africa as well as other developing countries should be able to count on committed partners who would help them to integrate themselves into the world economic system. We should be able to adopt a collective strategy, win-win and global strategy on a true partnership of solidarity which would be effective and which would help us get closer to our targets. I would like to put a question to the panelists on the efficiency of international cooperation from the standpoint of the debt burden of developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madame. Mr. Samavera, could you please perhaps give the delegation perspectives in respect to that question about the international perspectives? Thank you.
Oui, je pense que c'est un sujet.
Yes, I believe this is an absolutely key issue. There were two components to it, the international dimension and the pilot program. I think we need to define what sustainable economies are in UN terms, because the situation we are in today is if a country is highly indebted, then the trend in the monetary fund is to say you need to focus on paying back the debt, reduce your costs, and historically this has led to policies which affect growth and employment. And that continues to be the situation today. If you look, for example, at policies which are being applied in Europe, in Greece, in other countries, you see that the problem stems from the fact that the debt needs to be repaid as quickly as possible, and then we'll lend you money to repay your debts. So you're quite right to link the debt of a country and policies or conditions placed upon this country so that it can continue to pay its debt, and the social conditions and level of poverty in that country. Today, this is one of the reasons I've said if we don't have an alternative understanding of what an economy is, what sustainable development is, then things won't change. Is there only one definition of an economy, the one that's prevailed over the past 20 or 30 years, or can we understand investment and markets and the way in which the industry is managed and is sustained and the impact it has on the environment? Can we look at it that way? Or will we just be looking at economies where the main focus is financing and repayment of debts? I think that we all have an opportunity here together and the possibility within the United Nations to ask that question. And we can see that there are solutions today which can work and other solutions which aren't the right answer because the human being is not part of the equation, because we're dealing then just with figures and not with people. So I think you're quite right. But it requires a change in mindset. It can be done. I think it must be done. But it's not going to come from the traditional stakeholders focusing on economies, but it can come from countries discussing these issues within the United Nations. On the other point, and perhaps this ties in with what our friend from Namibia has said, I'm not proposing this as a solution necessarily, but the initiatives coming from the center need to be implemented at the local level, either by the municipality, through schools. There are a number of options. Sometimes it can be industry. It really depends on the local situation in any given country. But the difficulty of managing from the center something that is taking place at the local level is really quite complex. So if you involve local actors, then there's a better possibility for things to work out right.
Thank you very much. I now call on the distinguished representative from the European Union.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The European Union thanks the keynote speaker, Mr. Joan Suavia, and the members of the panel for their very inspiring contributions. The European Union has two questions, but before raising these two questions, I would like to provide some very brief contextual elements. The European Union is committed to implement the 2030 agenda in a comprehensive and integrated way, both in its internal and its external policies. Globalization, digitization, automatization, and international fragmentation of production in global value chains have profound impact on the world of work and societies, and this in different regions and countries. It provides both important opportunities and important challenges. In Europe, despite recent improvements, labor market exclusion, especially for young people, increased income inequality, debt of poverty, and challenges related to housing access remain areas of the biggest concern. In order to effectively eradicate poverty in all its forms and dimensions in a changing world, we need to integrate social policies and actions in a wider social, employment, economic, and environmental policies and governance. More decent jobs and investment that prioritize social and economic inclusion and inclusive growth have the best potential of bringing people out of poverty. But at the same time, we need effective social protection and wider social inclusion throughout the entire life cycle, starting at an early age, preventing and tackling child poverty, then for the active age population, and also ensuring rights and services for aging people. The new European Social Pillar, proclaimed on the 17th of November last year in Gothenburg, in Sweden by the European Union leaders, European Commission and European Parliament, sets out 20 key principles and rights to support fair and well-functioning labor markets and welfare systems. Half of the principles and rights concern directly social protection and inclusion. The pillar will serve as a compass for the efforts by EU member states and their stakeholders and civil society towards more social convergence in the European Union. And these efforts will be supported by the European Union institutions. Now I come to the two questions. How could the work of the Commission for Social Development contribute best to ensuring a comprehensive approach to social policy, while at the same time identifying and supporting innovative, workable and sustained approaches to social protection and social inclusion? This comprehensive approach should also ensure specific attention to those furthest left behind, such as young people, persons with disabilities, those unable to earn sufficient income, and those who are out of work longer, like many older people. That's the first question. The second is, how can the Commission for Social Development best support the efforts made by the United Nations system, as well as regions, countries, social partners, and wider civil society, towards the progressive realization of universal social protection floors and systems? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, distinguished representative. We will put those questions in a parking lot. We have a number of other delegations that really want to speak to the floor, so we will have those questions and move forward. So thank you. I'd now like to call on the NGOs and acknowledge all NGOs who are observing this important high-level panel. And Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, seat 2755, 2755. You have the floor.
Thank you so much to all these speakers. Thank you to FES, to Worldwide Network Nigeria, and to the APSP. I am particularly pleased with that all these speakers have actually or impliedly stated that social protection is a fundamental part of poverty reduction. Africa's recent progress on social protection and poverty is commendable. But a lot of challenges remain, and there are a lot of other missed opportunities, primarily because governments see social protection and social support as a charity and a token. These beliefs affect the effectiveness, the reach, and the sustainability of social protection programs in Africa. Africa is particularly vulnerable because many governments stay too long and forget about their mandates, or are too self-centered to even know what their mandates are towards these populations. So social protection is seen as a charity or a reward to those who are politically affiliated to them or sympathizers to governments and some state institutions. I believe to circumvent this, social protection should be legislated in our national laws and constitutions, so that no matter how much governments come and go, laws will always remain to be national institutions. Like many civil and political rights, social and economic rights should be enshrined in our constitutions and our national laws. This is important for continuity, sustainability, and the allocation of financial resources towards this program. A few countries that I can quote in Africa are South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, because they have some provisions on social protection in their constitutions. Now my question to the panelists, especially the guest speaker: how do we influence our governments to see social protection as a right and legislate it, and not only as a charity or reward to those close to them? Thank you so much, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I will move forward to invite the distinguished representative from the ILO to take the floor, keeping in mind your question, sir.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Many thanks for this excellent panel discussion. We are also pleased to listen to Mr. Somavia's comprehensive, brilliant intervention. I have a question to the Vice President of Costa Rica, Madame Chacon, and to the Minister of Egypt, Madame Wali. So Mr. Somavia, he started his intervention by mentioning the SG's proposals related to the reform of the UN development system. So in the context of the UN reform, how best can the UN system, including the international financial institutions, support your countries in implementing the SDGs, in particular in extending social protection and eradicating poverty? So in very concrete terms, as per your experience dealing with the UN system, what are you doing right? What are you doing wrong? And what can be done to improve and to meet your expectations? So I'd appreciate a response by the Vice President and by the Minister, followed by a comment by Mr. Somavia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will take one more distinguished representative and then bring it back to the panel, so thank you. The distinguished representative for Cuba, please take the floor.
Gracias.
Thank you. The panelists have referred to a number of issues of particular importance, most directly linked to ways we can help eradicate poverty, including the fact that they said you shouldn't be measuring poverty just in terms of income. They also spoke about the importance of data, and data certainly are important. If we look at global statistics of the World Food Programme, we can see that it is alarming to note that today hunger continues to kill more people than malaria, tuberculosis, and AIDS put together. The Vice President of Costa Rica clearly referred to the fact that eradicating poverty is our responsibility, and not all governments are showing the same level of commitment. In general, all the panelists referred in various ways to the need to combat poverty through a multidimensional approach. This multidimensional nature of poverty also requires a multidimensional response. And I would respectfully ask all of you present in this room to reread the statements made just recently by the delegation of Egypt on behalf of the G77 and by the African group. Those statements are quite clear on this issue. In our multidimensional response, my delegation would like to focus on the impact of international cooperation. Cuba, like many other countries, provides a modest but very clear-cut contribution to social development in other countries in the South. We would like to know the view of panelists with regard to what role official development aid should play as an expression of international cooperation to complement national efforts aimed at eradicating poverty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now return to the panel. We have a number of questions that I invite panelists to respond to. The distinguished representative from the European Union, certainly there were 2 questions, and also to our colleague from civil society and the ILO, and now the representative from Cuba. So could I just kick it off with Mr. Somavia?
Yes. In relation to the question from our civil society friend, you know, it's a variety of issues, because when the practice of social policy historically began as charity. There's a long history that it was charity that was dealing with the issues of social policy. Then suddenly social policy had another dimension, and it happened in Germany. The leader of Germany said, look, it's important to have social policy because I need workers that are healthy. Healthy and maybe more educated, because then our economy is going to work better. So the second stage of social policy was in the interest of the system for workers to be sufficiently useful, quote unquote. And that evolved particularly in Europe, in the United States, in Japan after the Second World War, into a component of the type of society they wanted to have. And if you take a look at 1945 to 1980, Europe, the United States, and Japan created their middle classes that now are complicated. But that's when it was created. It was created through a combination of growth and social policy. And social policy was very much a part of the mix. Why am I saying all of this? That going towards, in a world that is moving towards sustainable development, moving towards social policy is sort of an inevitable process. That's the direction in which things are going to be going. How do you make them reality at the national level? Activism, organization at the level of civil society, organization at the level of trade unions, organization at the level of people living in poverty. These are things that in certain society has actually worked. So if you want to push forward a notion that this has to eventually become recognized social rights, activism and organization is a very important part of it. The second one is that inevitably, if that process takes hold, this will become a part of the political process. And the political process at some point in time has to deal with these questions, whether in elections, whether in elections when you're electing a mayor. In the political process, people will have to decide whether they believe that this should be social rights inscribed in the Constitution, or they should continue to be treated as rewards for those that believe and think like you, or charity. The more you make it part of the process, that implies that you need to have some sort of space in terms of freedom of the press and freedom of expression. I come from a country that had a dictatorship for 17 years. It was not through those means that we would have advanced some of the issues that we did advance in the case of my own country, so that has to be taken into account. And finally, you have international cooperation. Precisely when things are rather complicated and closed, the whole space of international cooperation can take an important dimension. That international cooperation directed towards civil society is extremely important. The fact that people from the civil society movements can be part of the global discussions or international discussions normally reinforces and highlights their capacity to move within their own societies. In the end, it's a struggle. And in any social struggle, the solutions are not obvious. But there are enough examples of the types of things that I am saying that may be applicable to the case, with the case you're mentioning. In relation to the questions from my good friend from the European Union and some of the comments from the head of the ILO, I think that we're in the process of defining that. I don't think that anybody can tell you today, look, the function of the Commission for Social Development in the evolution of the sustainable development paradigm is this, and that. We're precisely in the process of understanding that you have to move from a unilateral, unidimensional views to multidimensional views and to integrated policies. So it's not going to be through one commission that is going to happen. And yet my feeling is that of the functional commissions, this is the one that is further ahead in actually defining the problem, in actually saying what the problem is. So my feeling is that on the basis particularly of this meeting, the conversation that is going to take place within the Department of Economic and Social Affairs is precisely how do you respond to this multidimensional and integrated challenge that we all have in front of us. My thinking is that this is an enormous opportunity for the United Nations. But opportunities come and go. You have to be able to catch the opportunity as it is passing in front of you. Now, there is an opportunity passing in front of the United Nations system as a whole, which is enormous. And I believe that what the Secretary General is trying to do is to catch the opportunity. But that implies that you need to put a system that has thought sectorially and in silos, in tandem, so that they can begin producing new knowledge, develop new knowledge, and in that knowledge respond to these issues. For some organizations, this is going to be less difficult than others. For example, for the ILO, the ILO feels that its decent work agenda has been acknowledged by the Sustainable Development Goals. It feels that its proposals for social protection have been acknowledged. Even a decision taken in the middle of the crisis by the ILO, which is to agree on a global jobs pact, is part. So you have there an organization which is not difficult to insert itself with its agenda within the Sustainable Development Goals, and at the same time be a part of a wider thinking process. So if the different specialized agencies can actually do that and say, yes, we are there, but not because we have a goal, which is what happened to the Millennium Development Goals. This is my goal. So I'm going to promote my goal. Any organization of the UN that says this is my goal has not understood a thing, which is not the case of the ILO precisely because I have been seeing the capacity of the ILO to say, well, this is my responsibility, which is a different concept. These issues that are here happen to be part of our agenda. Our responsibility is to help define the manner in which decent work and social protection floors and others operate. That's our responsibility. But we are part of a much wider exercise in which the knowledge that we have from our space can be useful to the rest. But that process is in the making. We are exactly moving in that direction, but it's a new direction. So, but as a consequence of all of this, this commission, of all of the debates that I've seen within the UN lately, is the one that is farthest ahead in understanding and with this I end, the multidimensionality, the integrated nature, the fact that you need to work together, that you have to look sideways, etc. So I'm pretty optimistic about the role that this commission is going to play into the future. Now, what is going to be that role? I don't think that we can probably define it at this stage, but we're certainly moving in a direction of which this commission is going to be very important.
Thank you very much. Panellists are very eager to respond, and I have 5 more delegations that would also like to make a statement. So I will keep moving with the delegations and ask the panellists to make short, sharp responses. So thank you. The good thing is that we're all engaged and we want to all move forward. So I'm just going to move to civil society, and it will be the International Presentation Association, Sustain US, and International Federation on Ageing in that order. Please make your statements or questions short and sharp. Seat 2753 is the International Presentation Association, 2730 Sustain US, and 2749 International Federation on Ageing. And then I'll go back to the floor and invite the distinguished representative from Brazil to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity and for the wonderful inputs that you have given. I have 2 questions. The first one is, how do you see the link between extreme wealth in the hands of a few leading to objectification, commodification, and exploitation of vulnerable people and the earth? Do you have some strategies for stemming extreme wealth? The second question is, since it is not possible to eradicate poverty without the participation of affected communities, what could be the long-term policies to ensure communities have a voice in the type of development they need and they have the capacity to do it? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now move to Sustain US 2730.
First of all, I would like to thank all of the esteemed panelists for joining us today and for your continued dedication to both ending poverty and inequality. Several of you touched on this already, but studies have shown that early childhood intervention programs and ensuring equal access to education, healthcare, and housing lead to long-term positive social and economic outcomes. However, many youth and adults still remain in poverty. My question is, how can future poverty eradication policies effectively combine both the need to strengthen early intervention programs with the need to improve social protection in order to lift adults and their families out of intergenerational poverty? Thank you.
Thank you very much. International Federation on Aging 2749.
Thank you very much. I'm very heartened to hear all that is being done to reduce poverty. I am, however, also discouraged that we have been talking about poverty for so many decades, and we are still talking about the lack of data. How have governments been developing their policies in the past without the evidence? If we haven't got data about the most vulnerable groups, who have our policies been benefiting? For those of us who have lived a long time, we are saddened that in 2018 we are still talking about not knowing enough about those who need help. Perhaps the 2030 Agenda will urge governments to increase their commitment to leaving no one behind. My question is, current pension systems tend to perpetuate existing income inequalities. While they often provide coverage for the private, public, and military sectors, there is nothing for the informal sector. They exclude older women who toil most of their life in the informal sector and are denied social protection at the time they most need it. I would very much like to hear a little bit more about what is being done about the informal sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on the distinguished representative from Brazil, followed by the distinguished representative from South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the outset, let me congratulate the panelists for the high level of the debate in this afternoon discussion. Brazil endorses the concern expressed here with the homeless population. Data is of the essence, and we believe that the UN system could be doing more. Recognizing the need to reform and to make the CSocD more focused and action-oriented, we think that the situation of homeless people could be considered as an emerging issue of incoming CSocD sessions. It is our understanding that UN agencies such as UN Habitat, WHO, ILO, and UNDP could offer more information and best practice. There is a lot of existing expertise within the system, but maybe there could be a better coordination about the issue of homeless populations. A discussion with the member states about the topic could also be relevant and review international standards regarding the issue. We would appreciate the comments of the panel regarding additional contributions that could be made by CSocD and the UN system on the issue of homeless people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, the distinguished representative from South Africa.
Thank you very much, moderator. Thank you very much for the valuable contribution by the panelists. As South Africa, we just want to make a few comments pertaining the strategies that can be put in place to eradicate poverty. As South Africa, we have adopted the National Development Plan, which was done following a vigorous diagnostic review that amongst us showed triple challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. One of the critical strategies for eradicating poverty to achieve sustainable development was through inclusive and responsive social protection system. And out of that, we realized that as South Africans, our constitution is beautiful because it has a human rights approach. Section 27 of our constitution states that everyone has a right to have access to healthcare services, the right to social security, including if they are unable to support themselves and their dependents, and appropriate social assistance, and that the state must make reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to achieve the progressive realization of each of these rights. So the government prioritized then the spending on water, housing, healthcare, education, and social security in line with our constitution, which is also the Bill of Rights as well as the National Development Plan objectives. I must indicate that through the social protection, South Africa, we focus on the comprehensive social protection services, and then we look into the human rights approach through the life cycle approach. For example, in terms of providing social security through cash transfers, focusing on the child support grants from birth, also looking into the issues of early childhood development program and primary health care for children, as well as immunization, and ensuring that the children, they go to these ECDs and they don't have to pay if they're from vulnerable households, as well as ensuring that at schools, as part of a social protection measure, they are provided with the National School Nutrition Program, as well as the Social Relief of Distress, which is in the form of even school uniform in case children do not have adequate support. And at a teenager level, the students that are provided with the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, which means that the youth and the children from vulnerable families are supported with a free education at a tertiary school level. In a nutshell, it shows that South Africa is a way of managing the support to these vulnerable children, to provide even free basic services in terms of the household food and nutrition security programs, community nutrition development centers, home care-based services, luncheon clubs programs, as well as low-cost housing for those families that do not have adequate houses. There's one question from one of the participants, a moderator, who was worried, how can we ensure that government align themselves with these strategies? For example, what we have done in South Africa was the fact that in terms of the National Development Plan, it is aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals, which is 2030 vision, which means that as we achieve the national development plans for the country, we are also at the same time achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a UN framework for the countries. For example, the way we coordinate our NDP, we have come up with a program of action in terms of these goals, which are then the government outcomes. And you find that in each government minister, as an executive, has a responsibility to coordinate each outcome, and quarterly will report an account to the president and to the country. How far are you achieving those outcomes that you are supposed to coordinate? And by so doing, we are able to account in terms of the work that we are doing towards eradicating poverty and other strategies to uplift the lives of our communities. For example, the Minister for the Department of Social Development has a responsibility to coordinate the social protection outcome, which is outcome 13, and which is the chapter 11 in terms of the national development plan of the country. And she coordinates other government departments that contribute to that outcome, like Department of Labor, Health, Education, and others. So I must indicate that these outcomes in terms of the NDP of the country, we are able to alleviate, to contribute towards the alleviation of poverty as a country.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are going to close the list now, but I would like, last and not least, to call on Seroptimist International 2754, and then we're going to bring it back to the panel to make their final comments. Thank you. A very brief comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Barbara Rockman. I represent Seroptimist International, which is a global group working to educate women and girls and to enable them and empower them. I wanted to ask you about the strategies and policies to eradicate poverty at the global level. I would like to point out that the UN Global Compact on Migration can have a significant impact on poverty reduction when it is adopted this year and implemented. Negotiations will begin later in February, and I also point out that SDG 10.7 speaks to implementation of such a compact. So I wonder what you, the panelists, and especially the delegations who are here, what you can do to assure that the Migration Compact will include strong protections for migrants in vulnerable situations, especially women and children, will include effective actions to promote social cohesion, inclusion of migrants into societies, and provisions against xenophobia, racism, and discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In closing the panel now, I would like each panellist to provide a response to some of the questions just briefly. You know, some of the questions raised issues around extreme wealth, vulnerability, climate, what long-term policies we needed to put in place around engagement, you know, early childhood poverty reduction, how can we see that in the future, questions about data and how can we be 2018 and still not know enough, you know, about current pensions and inequities and the sectors that need to come together. So I would ask each panellist in the order that they spoke to perhaps keep in mind some of those questions, but if there was one message that you wanted the delegates in front of us to take away with them, what would that single message be? So I would first of all call on Her Excellency Ana Helena Chacon, Vice President of Costa Rica.
Thank you.
I would like to respond quite clearly to something which could take into account all of the questions that have been raised. The NGO asked about the SDGs. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? And what else can be done? With the example of Costa Rica, I think we're doing well. We have a national pact with all sectors and powers in society, judicial, executive, the Supreme Court, to be involved in this process, but we also have a number of other sectors in this compact. There's a technical secretariat at the head of the compact, which outlines the goals that need to be achieved in each of the sectors. And each of these sustainable development goals are included in our national development plan. Everyone knows then what needs to be done so that on an annual basis we can measure the impact and determine whether or not we are achieving these 17 important goals by 2030. We are committed to these SDGs, and we are convinced that we will only achieve these goals with the assistance of many other people who are working with us. We don't all have the same level of investment or the same pace in all sectors. Not everyone is working at the pace we would like. We do need to have more data so that we are quite certain where we need to do our work so that we can reach all sectors of the population to meet these 17 SDGs. This has to do with environmental issues, the gender gap, poverty. We need to continue to work along these lines with the assistance that we receive in all sectors of our country.
Thank you very much. And Her Excellency Dr. Ghada Wali, Minister of Social Solidarity of Egypt, could I ask the panellists to keep their final message quite crisp? Otherwise, the chair is not going to have the opportunity to close the session. So thank you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I have very little to say. The questions and the comments are all thought-provoking, and I would like to confirm that I'm quite optimistic because I believe that there is a role to play. The role of the commissions and the agencies is not to achieve the SDGs. The responsibility and the ownership of the SDGs is at the governments and at the states level. It's communities and governments and the people have to own the SDGs and work towards implementing them. The work that can be done here helps in reforming the thinking. And I don't think that working in sectors is exclusive from, working together. The better you know the sector and the complexity of the sector that you work in, the more you realize that you need to work with others to achieve your goals. So I think we can, combine both. We need to know our sectors well, focus on improvements in our sectors, but at the same time, realize and see the linkages and the interrelation and the interdependability between the different sectors and the need to work together to be stronger and better. On data collection, I couldn't agree more. Yes, we haven't been doing very well, especially at my part of the world, on collecting data. However, data collection is costly, especially when it's on the informal sector. So there's a cost to collecting data, there's a technology that is needed to collect data, and there's a political price that you have to be willing to pay if you are to share data. Sometimes data is there, but it's not politically correct to share all of the data from some institutions. I'm being very, very honest here. So yes, governments have to constantly collect data and announce data and share data. NGOs also have to be able to share and be informed and know information about the different target groups that they are trying to serve. And commissions such as this and forums such as this should come out with concrete and pragmatic solutions that are close to realities and to the real challenges of the people. And I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next, Mr. Mark Kamperhoff. Thank you, Mark.
Yes, thank you also, and I will try and promise to be brief too. First, on the question of implementation, when it comes to implementing the SDGs, as I said, our national strategy is deliberately called the National Sustainable Development Strategy in order to stress the point that it's about the SDGs and about the national implementation of the international goals. Then, as a second point, the Global Compact on Migration is another topic, but as you know, there were these thematic clusters before, and one was about trafficking, human trafficking, and as we all know, it's mostly women and girls that are affected by these by this problem. So we were really involved in this specific one thematic cluster, and we will definitely continue to towards adopting the GCM, of course. Also, Then about the data question, of course we need to know what we do, and we think, or I can speak for Germany, we think that we have a lot of data, but we want to go even further, because we say we also need sex disaggregated data, because if you have a new measure, it can be completely different it can have a completely different effect on women or on men, as you see with the example of the gender pay gap. But then as a next step, with going even further than data, we actually introduced a youth check. That means that we check every measure that we propose or that we adopt in a way as how far it can actually affect younger people, especially younger people, and what effect it can have on their situation. And last but not least, I would like to come back on the role of the CSD and end with kind of a positive note, because I really like the idea that Mr. Somavia pointed out in his keynote in the beginning. I mean, of course, the CSocD is a big structure. The UN is even bigger, but what is inside? It's us. It's the people that come here, be it as a member, as a participant, as an observer, as a guest, with a mandate. I mean, we all have a kind of a mandate. We don't always have instructions. I agree with you. And I mean, we all want to achieve something. We're not here just for fun. We want to reach out to the people and achieve something. And maybe we have to think about that also in the end, while we're sitting here negotiating and really discussing, all of us together. So that's my final note. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last two final comments. Firstly, Mr. Mark McGreevy, and then final comment to Mr. Juan Samavia.
So 3 very quick points. To the person who asked about extreme wealth, I always find it amusing as a head of an NGO that has to raise $50 million a year, a conversation about extreme wealth. I'm always grateful when I get it. But that said, to one side, I do think that we need to continue to have sensible discussions about economic and social compromise. It can't be all about profit. It can't be all about competition. It can't be all about consumerism. It has to be about the common good. That's on that point. The second point, to my friend from the voluntary sector who talks about housing as a debate, absolutely, housing and homelessness, we need to get on the agenda, and I'll meet with you afterwards and we'll go and plan something. And then the third and last point I wanted to make was I was trying to sum up Mr. Samavia's speech for my Twitter account, and I think I got it in one line, which is, it's very complicated but well worth it. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you. Last comment to our keynote speaker, Mr. Samavia.
Well, thank you so much. Maybe I'll pick up from where Mr. McGreevy left it and Mark. I think that the inequality issue is a major issue of our times. It's happened. Who would think 30 years ago that we would, the notion of super rich would suddenly emerge? It's there, but it's very difficult to look aside. So I won't go into the detail of it, but there's no doubt that, come back to this commission has the mandate to be able to look at this issue. And probably it should be part of whatever you look into the future. This is not an ideological issue. This is essentially an ethical issue. It's what sort of society do we want to have, and what is the society that permits, the sort of differences that we have today in terms of richness and income. So I won't belabor the point. I think it's essential. We need to put it there. But again, here we come to the point that Mark was making, and I'll make it again and then close. This very fantastic thing that the delegate is part of the solution. You see, it's the way we think as a person, as a human being, on the issues that we're asked to be discussing. And whether we give it enough, whether we prepare ourselves sufficiently well, whether we look at the details, whether we don't just come to a meeting and come in and out and don't really give it much importance, how how engaged we are. I want to say how professional, because that's how engaged are we with the issues. And I just want to leave that message with you, because my experience is that I have seen enough engagement in the delegates that deal with social issues in the United Nations as to be able to have imagined one day that a social summit was possible. And the only reason I felt that I wanted to dare to propose it is because I had chaired the third committee, and the third committee, the people there impressed me in terms of commitment, and in fact we were able to do it. So the power you have in your hands is pretty big if you choose to use it. And I would leave you with that idea. Use it. Use it to the hilt. Use it for the sort of good that you think that you can do while you're here, by orienting, by putting ideas on the resolutions, by not giving up on what you think is important, by negotiating with the other side. I may have an instruction, but ask him as a human being what he thinks about it, etc., etc., etc. That is perfectly possible. I saw it happen from nothing, crazy idea. We had the biggest meeting of heads of state in 50 years in the UN. So these things are possible. So go ahead and do it, because we are again in a creative stage. Nobody can come and tell you, well, this is the way we've always done it, so we're going to go on doing it this way. No way. Nobody can say that. Creativity is there for the taking. So, go ahead and do it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been an honour to moderate this panel, and I hand the chair back to the chair.
Thank you so much, and distinguished delegates, colleagues, we've reached the end of this really fascinating high-level panel discussion. I'd like particularly to thank Ms. Barrett for moderating the session so well. I'd like to thank Mr. Somavia for the inspiration you gave us both during your keynote speech and now at the end. And I'd like to thank all our high-level panelists for their participation, extremely interesting ideas, and for you, colleagues, for your participation as well. Thank you very much. Before we adjourn, I'd just like to inform you that the Commission will resume the general discussion of items 3A and B tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. The latest list of speakers has been circulated on eDelegate. The meeting is adjourned. I wish you a good evening. Thank you.